The Clerk will read the order of today.
Mr. President.
The Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move, according to contingent notice, that standing and session orders be suspended to allow a motion to be moved forthwith. The private member's business item number 295, outside the order of precedence relating to Coptic Christians in Egypt, be called on forthwith.
Yeah, that's right. I'll be here forever too.
Is anyone seeking the call on urgency? Then I'll put the question. The question is that standing and sessional orders be suspended. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. President.
Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile.
I move that private member's business item number 295, outside the order of precedence, be called on forthwith.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile.
Mr. President, I move private member's business item number 295, outside the order of precedence, standing in my name on the notice paper for today. I gave notice of this motion the other day, and I'll just refresh the members as to the content of that motion. That this House recognises that Coptic Christians in Egypt are suffering ongoing and increasing persecution. 2, condemns the recent attacks on Coptic Christians in Egypt. 3, expresses its sympathy for Coptic Christians who have been victims of recent attacks in Egypt. And 4, calls on the government A, to issue a public statement condemning the ongoing attacks against the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt. B, makes immediate representations to the United Nations to end the persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt. And C, strongly urges the Egyptian government to provide equal rights and protections for all Egyptian citizens, regardless of race or religion. The issue that brought this motion forward as an urgent motion to take precedence over our other business today was the brutal attack on the Coptic Christian citizens in Cairo last Sunday, the 9th of October. Members would have seen the shocking television coverage, including the armoured troop carriers crashing into the peaceful Coptic citizens who were taking part in the protest. This has been a climax, you might say, of attacks that have been occurring over a long period of time against the Coptic Christian citizens of Egypt. Members of the House will know that the Coptic Christians are the descendants of the original inhabitants of Egypt. They descended from the pharaohs who built the classic Egyptian civilization along the Nile Valley in cities such as Luxor, and the builders of the Great Pyramid of Giza, which remain the tallest man-made structure in the world for more than 3,800 years. The Copts have a long and proud history as Christians, which dates back to the 4th century. In the year 641 AD, when the Arab Muslims invaded Egypt, Christianity was the majority religion in Roman Egypt. Despite the political upheaval following that invasion, Egypt remained a mainly Christian land until the end of the 12th century. Since becoming a minority, Christians in Egypt have experienced centuries of discrimination. However, the position of Copts did improve in the early 19th century. During this liberal period, Copts participated in the Egyptian national movement for independence and occupied many influential positions in government and society. Although they represented at that time about 10 to 20% of the population, they were so economically prosperous that they held more than 50% of the nation's wealth. However, following the coup in 1952 led by Nasser, the conditions of the Copts then deteriorated. The prejudicial legal framework had created a permissive environment that allows Egyptian officials to freely discriminate against Christians with impunity. Christian religious courts were closed and the regime confiscated land and church properties. Permits to construct new churches were delayed. The Nasser government also adopted socialist policies which further adversely affected the Copts as they were mainly dependent on private business for their livelihood. The economic pressures and resurgent discrimination led many Copts to start migrating to countries such as the USA, Canada, Australia and Europe. Today, there are about 4 million Copts living outside Egypt, including an estimated 100,000 Coptic citizens, Christians in Australia, who have been successfully assimilated into our nation and have made an invaluable contribution to our economic prosperity, and some of their representatives are in the public gallery here today. However, today, as a religious minority, the Copts have been subject to ongoing and significant discrimination in modern Egypt and are the target of attacks by particularly militant Islamic extremist groups. There are many examples that I could quote of these attacks on the Christian minority in Egypt. Members will remember on January 2010 in the town of Nag Hammadi, 3 men sprayed automatic gunfire on Coptic churchgoers leaving a midnight mass. 7 people were killed and others were injured. On the 1st of January 2011, a bomb was detonated in front of a Coptic church, the Two Saints Church in Alexandria, where a New Year's prayer service was being held. 23 people, Mr. President, died as a result of that attack, all of them Coptic Christians, and 97 more were injured. This has been one of the deadliest acts of violence against the Egyptian Christian minority in more than a decade, until the events of last Sunday. There have been many other examples that I could quote. Mr. President, the seriousness of this situation has been confirmed by the independent bipartisan US federal government's commission. This commission was appointed by President Obama and the leadership of both political parties in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Their report, issued in 2011, stated, quote, "The Egyptian government has engaged in and tolerated religious freedom violations before and after President Mubarak stepped down on February the 11th, 2011. It goes on to say serious problems of discrimination, intolerance and other human rights violations against members of religious minorities as well as disfavoured Muslims remain widespread in Egypt. Violence targeting Coptic Orthodox Christians remained high during the reporting period. This high level of violence and the failure to convict those responsible, including 2 of the 3 alleged perpetrators of the 2010 Nag Hammadi attack, continue to foster a climate of impunity, making further violence more likely." The report goes on to say, quote, "The Egyptian government has failed to protect religious minorities, particularly Coptic Christians, from violent attacks, including during the transitional period when minority communities are increasingly vulnerable." It concludes, since February the 11th, military and security forces have used excessive force and live ammunition targeting of Christian places of worship and various demonstrations. So, Mr. President, all of us, as I said, were shocked by the events that occurred last Sunday. On the 9th of October 2011, a march by Coptic Christians in Cairo to demand an end to the ongoing persecution and discrimination ended with the deaths of up to 40 Coptic protesters who were beaten, gunned down and bulldozed by army troop carriers in a rampage directed by Egyptian army personnel with the assistance of some local Islamic extremists. Hundreds more are believed to have been injured. The exact numbers are still being confirmed. The clashes occurred just after a week following an arson attack on 2 Coptic churches in the south of the country. Coptic protests have been held in Maspero, Cairo, over the past month, calling for an end to the persecution of Coptic Christians. State television initially only reported 2 soldiers' deaths, claiming the military came under fire from the Copts. Witnesses, however, on the ground have confirmed that the march was attacked by people described as thugs in plain clothes, who were later joined by the military. It is not clear, Mr. President, who these thugs were or represented. They may have been part of the previous Mubarak government that has lost power. There have been also reports that the Egyptian military attacked the television office in Cairo, preventing its program going to air, which would have provided the television coverage of the Army's violent attacks on protesters. So that's an example of censorship to prohibit that information being made available to the mainstream Egyptian population. However, it's believed that even our Australian media have also reflected this bias in the mainstream Egyptian media sources and have reflected the official government position rather than some of the facts that did occur on the ground. The Australian Coptic movement, who I work closely with, notes that the latest attack demonstrates the clear pattern set by the Egyptian military of participating in and facilitating the obvious ethnic cleansing that Egyptian Coptic Christians are facing post the revolution. And I'm sure, Mr. President, all of us were very pleased to see the move towards democracy in Egypt as well as in other Middle East nations. And there were great hopes for the future of all the citizens of Egypt, both Christian and Muslim. And so it's a great disappointment to see some of these events now occurring. Bishop Sarrell, head of the Coptic Orthodox Church in Australia, has now issued a statement demanding the expulsion of the Egyptian ambassador and the two Egyptian consul generals, so as Australia could indicate its strong opposition to these attacks on Coptic Christians in Cairo. The bishop stated, quote, "Their presence in Australia is of no meaning to the Coptic community in Egypt in the light of the events which have occurred in Egypt and their subsequent failure to act in a capacity which represents the interests of both the Coptic and Muslim dynamic of the community. They have failed to take a proactive approach to advocate the rights of Coptic people in Egypt or to speak out against the atrocities and the intense persecution of the Coptic people that the Coptic people in Egypt are facing." So, Mr. President, that's a very strong demand by the religious leaders of the Coptic community here in our own nation. The international community will be held accountable if they do not act swiftly on the brutal attacks towards Egypt's Coptic Christians who are suffering under a modern-day form of apartheid, where institutionalised discrimination and deadly attacks have become a way of life for Egypt's Coptic population, which there are no clear fixed numbers, but they vary between 10 and 15 million. But as I said earlier, of course, they were originally the main population of Egypt. I also have a statement from the bishop that I've just been quoting, in which he says, quote, "The most serious events occurred on Sunday when approximately 10,000 Coptic Christians peacefully marched from Shoebridge in central Cairo to the state television building in Maspero. The Coptic protesters were protesting against the persecution they had been subject to and the burning of Coptic churches. The Muslim villagers attacked one of our churches in Aswan, claiming it was a guest house and could not be used as a church, despite the governor granting a permit for these renovations. Upon inquiry, the governor denied granting a permit for the renovations and washed his hands of the situation. The governor endorsed these attacks and continues to sit by idly, along with the other diplomats and figures of authority in Egypt as well as in Australia. The current Egyptian Prime Minister has failed to introduce anti-discrimination laws which allows for a unified process for the building of mosques and churches. Just for the interest of members, as most members would know, there are no restrictions in Egypt on building of mosques, but there are many restrictions on the building of Christian churches and even on modest renovations and repairs to a Christian church has to go through a whole amount of red tape, and usually those requests are denied. The bishop goes on to say in his statement, the peaceful protesters, many of whom were carrying crosses, were attacked by military and police forces who were meant to be the law enforcers. Stones and glass were thrown from the surrounding bridges and walls. The armoured personnel carriers were driven through the crowds and ran down the Coptic Orthodox protesters. Thugs, as I said earlier, these unidentified thugs, ran through the protesters with swords, killing many innocent people, the bishop concluded. In summary, at least 24 Coptic Christians have been killed and over 200 wounded in the worst violence experienced since the Mubarak regime was overthrown in February this year. Since the February revolution, the Coptic people have been targets of escalated persecution, including New Year's Day's bombing of a Coptic church in Alexandria, which left 23 people dead and many more injured. The bishop strongly condemns the Egyptian government for the violation of human rights, which is currently occurring in mass scale. These acts of genocide are being facilitated by the government and the authorities in Egypt. And that's a statement issued by His Grace Bishop Sarrell, who is based in Melbourne. To sum up, Mr. President, Acting President, a number of organisations have issued statements on this matter that occurred last Sunday. One is Amnesty International, and in its statement it says the Egyptian army must answer for a deadly toll at Coptic protest. The Amnesty International statement goes on to say Egypt's Supreme Council of the Armed Forces must urgently explain how a protest against religious discrimination turned into a bloodbath. Amnesty International today said after deadly protests in Cairo on Sunday left at least 25 dead. The statement goes on to say more than 200 people, including many protesters and reporting members of the security forces, were also wounded in the incident. The worst violence in Egypt has been seen since former President Mubarak stepped down in February. Amnesty International goes on to say video footage shows military vehicles running over protesters while driving through crowded streets. So it's very important, Mr. President, that the House supports this motion today, and I personally would call on the Egyptian government to identify the individuals who were driving those armoured vehicles or who approved the use of those armoured vehicles, and that they should be prosecuted by the Egyptian government and by their own military. I also note in conclusion that the Honourable Kevin Rudd, our own Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs, in concert with the Honourable Julia Gillard, Prime Minister, have issued this statement. The Australian government today, this is on the 10th of October, the Australian government today expressed its deep concern at the violence and resulting loss of life and injuries that took place in Cairo overnight. According to current estimates, up to 23 people have died and over 150 were injured during clashes between protesters and security forces. The government, that's the Australian government, expresses its condolences to the friends and families of those killed. Last night's violence, the statement continues, follows an increase in sectarian tensions and violence affecting Coptic Christians in recent months, including attacks on churches. The Australian government calls for calm and for clear respect for religious freedoms, human rights and the rule of law as Egypt's historical transition to democracy continues. Now more than ever, it's a critical time for peace and stability. The head of the New South Wales Community Relations Commission has also issued a statement expressing sympathy to the state's Coptic community following the fatal clashes that occurred on the streets of Cairo. So, Mr. President, Madam Acting President, I commend the motion to the House and invite all members to support it. And I thank the House for allowing this motion to proceed today when it has taken precedence over other matters which were on the agenda for debate today. Thank you.
The Honourable David Clarke.
Madam Deputy President, the motion before us expresses our outrage at the continuing persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt. The motion today records our disgust and horror and condemnation that in Egypt at this time, innocent Coptic Christians are being discriminated against, are being persecuted and are being murdered because of their Christian faith. The motion today puts us in solidarity with the Coptic Christian Australian community, some who are here today in the gallery, who are grieving for their relatives and friends in present-day Egypt, who are being hounded and harassed and murdered from one end of the country to the other. We need to support this motion, Madam Deputy President. We need to support the persecuted of Egypt. We need to support the Coptic Christian community of Australia at this time of their grieving. And I congratulate the Reverend, the Honourable Fred Nile in bringing this resolution forward. And at the end of the debate, I hope that each and every member of this chamber will join in supporting the motion, in supporting the persecuted Coptic Christians of Egypt by supporting this motion. We should support this motion in the name of all of the people of New South Wales, because I'm sure that they're all behind this resolution. It doesn't matter what religious persuasion, what religious faith tradition, what ethnic background, what cultural background. I believe that all of the people of New South Wales are united in supporting this motion today. They would want us to carry this motion. And so we should support it in the name of the people of New South Wales, and we should show that we stand unambiguously and unhesitatingly and in solid determination behind the Coptic Christians who are being persecuted at this very time in Egypt. And, Madam Deputy President, the truth is that the Coptic people are the indigenous people of Egypt. Theirs is a heritage that goes back thousands and thousands of years. It is their ancestors who produced the great pharaohs of Egypt. It is their ancestors who were the builders of the great pyramids of Giza and the temples of Luxor and the great library of Alexandria, probably the most famous library in the history of the world. And their ancestors were pioneers in science and mathematics and astronomy and medicine and many, many other fields of human endeavour. These are the Coptic people of Egypt. Theirs is a history of illustrious achievement in the world. But today, the Coptic Christians of Egypt are being hounded and harassed from one end of Egypt to the other. And they are being hounded and harassed because they have kept their Christian faith over these last 2,000 years, and that's something that they will not yield on. And the truth is that Coptic Christian history has in many instances been erased from school books, as if those hundreds and hundreds of years never existed. What a melancholy time it is, and what a shameful time it is that they're being persecuted as they are, and that they're being murdered as they are. Only a few days ago, Madam Deputy President, 24 Coptic Christians were killed and over 300 injured in one incident alone, where they were attacked by Egyptian army tanks, merely because they were peacefully protesting for equal rights with the other citizens of Egypt. Only a few days ago, lawless mobs invaded a church in Al-Dahir in Cairo. And that church was torched, and it was looted, and it was ransacked, and it was demolished. And among those killed at these peaceful demonstrations, Madam Deputy President, have been Muslim Egyptians who have been expressing solidarity with their Coptic brothers and sisters. These righteous people have not been spared by these extremists. These righteous people have suffered along together with the Coptic people. The Coptic Christians thought that the Arab Spring would bring them greater freedom. But it hasn't brought them greater freedom, it is bringing them less freedom. They thought that they would be protected, but they have not been protected, and it is very, very alarming that elements of the Egyptian army seem to be joining in leading this persecution of the Coptic people. And it is proceeding at a growing frequency at the hands of fundamentalist extremists as well. The truth is that the screws are being tightened, turned even tighter on the Copts in present-day Egypt. And this latest violence is just part of a continuing, ongoing pattern that goes on month in and month out, and year in and year out. Girls, Coptic girls, are kidnapped and forced to convert. In February this year, the St. Bishi monastery was attacked by army tanks. In February this year, a priest was stabbed in the town of Shaoquett. In March of this year, churches were bombed in Safra and Laban. On the same day, 13 Coptic Christians were murdered in Manshiat Nassa. And it goes on and on. In April, Copts were killed by a mob of 5,000 in the town of Abu Caracas. In April of this year, the cathedral in Abu Sayah was attacked and was looted. A few weeks ago, a group of young Coptic youths were murdered on a train by a policeman out of uniform. As I said, this goes on month in and month out and year in and year out. And what happens to the perpetrators? What happens to these criminals? Nothing happens to them, because there is a process in Egypt, a sham process, where people are forced into a sham reconciliation conference where these things are meant to be talked out, but nobody is ever brought to trial. Nobody is ever brought to trial in these situations. The Copts can't even repair a church without getting either a presidential decree or getting a decree from a regional governor. What a shameful thing that is in present-day Egypt. The whole world, Madam Deputy President, knows what's going on. Human rights organisations are protesting. Leaders from all the religious faith traditions are protesting. People of goodwill all over the world are speaking out, and today we here in the Parliament of the people of New South Wales, we need to speak out too. We need to call for an end to discrimination against the Coptic Christians of Egypt. We need to call for an end to the persecution of the Coptic Christians. We need to call for an end to the destruction of the churches and the monasteries and the hospitals of the Coptic Christians. We need to call for an end to the murder of their priests and nuns and ordinary, everyday Coptic Christian citizens of Egypt. Today, Madam Deputy President, we should carry this resolution, and we should carry it with one voice. Thank you.
Thank you. I fully support this motion condemning the attacks on the Coptic Christian minority in Egypt, and thank the honourable member for bringing this issue to the House. Concern about the safety and treatment of the Christian minority in Egypt has been growing in recent months. Well, matters have escalated this week in Cairo, requiring our attention now. I also thank my colleague for providing us with an opportunity to show our support for and solidarity with the local Coptic Christian community, who have so many friends and families in the Middle East. Members will already know my views on the rights of individuals and families to practice the faith of their choosing. We respect another's beliefs, even different, and we expect ours to be respected in return. For while beliefs of faith are individual and personal matters, the respect we afford each other to pursue our faiths is a matter of democratic right, and respect and right. Over the years, I've had the honor of working and engaging with people of various faiths through interfaith dialogue, and I have noted their experience that interfaith dialogue inevitably enriches their own understanding of their own beliefs and deepens their own personal faith. It is my view, therefore, that a person of any faith should not fear the faith of another, provided that basic civil conventions of human rights and respect are adhered to by all. This is one of the greatest beauties and strengths of New South Wales, and I ask that we all bear this in mind as we consider the current situation in Egypt. About 10% of Egypt's 85 million people are Coptic Christian. In New South Wales, there are about 70,000 people who identify as Coptic Christians. It is a well-established community with many Coptic Christians having migrated here in the 1950s and 60s, and hence created long-established communities over many generations. On January the 19th, the Sydney Coptic Christian community held a major protest at Martin Place to draw attention to the events unfolding in Egypt. I note that my colleague, the Honourable Gregg Donnelly, represented the then Premier Christina Keneally and spoke at the rally. They were drawing our attention to the fact that the Egyptian authorities had allowed repeated attacks on Christians with impunity. This, of course, breaks the basic civil conventions of right and respect that I mentioned earlier. Members will be aware of my interest in the region through my activity with the Parliamentary Friends of Israel and the Jewish community. So they will not be surprised that I've been following the events in the region closely, particularly the so-called Arab Spring. It has become increasingly clear to me, sadly, that the Arab upheavals that swept the Middle East this year are not resulting in a democratic Arab Spring. Rather, we are seeing an extreme Islamic awakening occurring alongside a resurgence of extreme Arab nationalism. Unfortunately, in Egypt, this has turned into a concerted effort to drive out the Christian minority. Christians are not the only target either. There have been an unleashing of violent anti-Israel sentiment in Egypt. This was on full display on September the 9th when a mob stormed the Israeli embassy, forcing the evacuation of the Israeli ambassador and 86 embassy personnel. Eventually, commandos were sent to rescue the remaining 6 embassy staff following the American intervention. This is especially saddening given Egypt was the first of Israel's bordered neighbors to recognize its existence and begin a diplomatic relationship under Anwar Sadat. The peace agreement between Israel and Egypt is now under threat since the fall of Hosni Mubarak due to the unleashing of violent anti-Israel sentiment in Egypt. Egypt's transition to democratic elections should offer so much potential to the region, but democracy depends on the rule of law, and the rule of law in any workable sense is dependent on an ever-tenuous balance of competing rights and responsibilities. Critical among those rights to believe what we believe and to respect the beliefs of others that we do not. There is widespread concern that the military is failing to protect the Coptic Christians in a post-revolutionary Egypt that has seen the rise of Islamism and sectarian strife. The ruling military council is either powerless or unwilling to do anything about it. In recent months, there have been growing attacks on the Christian minority and other minorities in Egypt. In 2009, Amnesty International also expressed concern about attacks on Baha'i families in Egypt. All of this is an affront to the human rights of religious minorities and to Egypt's democratic aspirations. The events earlier this week started as a peaceful and unarmed protest in Cairo to draw attention to the attacks on several churches. About 1,000 Christian protesters tried to stage a peaceful sit-in in downtown Cairo. They were attacked by thugs with sticks, and the violence that spiraled out of control after a speeding military vehicle rammed into some of the Christians. The resulting outrage turned into what can only be described as a bloodbath. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families at this sensitive time, but the attacks on the Christian minority also deserve international condemnation. These attacks naturally dampen our expectations on Egypt's transition to democracy, but this violence should not derail that progress. Indeed, that would be a double tragedy. The move to elections on November 28th must continue, and hence the funerals of the 30 victims now begin both as an expression of grief, but also as an international protest on the attacks of the Christian minority, or indeed any minority in Egypt, as it aspires to be called democratic. On Monday, October the 10th, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister issued a joint statement expressing Australia's deep concern at the violence and loss of life. The Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister also called for calm and for clear respect for religious freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law in Egypt. Coptic Christians have been suffering persecution since the 11th century, and they continue to fear for their safety in present-day Egypt. The new Egyptian regime must ensure the Christian community, that all communities, are protected from all acts of violence and persecution. This violence must cease. Coptic Christians must be allowed to live in peace in the nation of Egypt if Egypt's claim to democratic government is to have any credibility. The respect of these basic rights is a prerequisite to the rule of law and to the foundation of democracy. It is also, in my view, the sign of faith. True, sincere, solid, mature, unshakable faith. I commend the motion to the House.
I rise to support the motion after the death of 30 Coptics at a demonstration following the partial destruction of their church. My condolences go to the Coptic community for their losses. The sectarian violence against the Coptic community, who make up 10% of Egypt's population, is well documented. This violence has been particularly pronounced since the 1970s, but of course dates back to the Roman Emperor Diocletian's massacre of Christians in 248 AD, a date which marks the beginning of the Coptic calendar. Following the Arab Spring, the movement, joined by Egyptians from both the Coptic and Muslim communities, it was hoped that a new era of secular brotherhood would exist in Egypt. The destruction of the church, ongoing opposition to construction of any church, and the targeting of members of the Coptic community raises a pall over the movement for freedom by the people of Egypt. On the 11th of May, the Egyptian government promised to lift restrictions on the buildings of churches the building of churches and extensions to existing churches, and this has not happened. I note that the Egyptian government has finally announced a commission that will look at to address the situation of Christian places of worship, none of which have a licence to operate anywhere across Egypt. As we know in this country, the issue of new places of worship can be a vexed one, but anyone who looks to across the valley from where I live at Bardwell Park, where the Coptic church and a mosque exist in harmony side by side, could not underestimate and should be a lesson for the government of Egyptian that you can do the same on behalf of the Coptic people in Egypt. Whether it is in Egypt, Syria, Bahrain or Libya, not only is the right to worship a basic right, the rights and lives of the citizens, particularly minorities, should be paramount. This is no more so than for the Coptic people who have suffered decades of persecution within Egypt. Thank you.
The Honourable Paul Green.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. Madam Deputy President, I rise in support of the motion by my colleague, the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile, to recognise the persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt. I also support calls for the government to condemn the persecution and to make immediate representations to the UN to end such persecutions. Madam Deputy President, of the 85 million people living in Egypt, approximately 10% are Coptic Christians. The Christians in Egypt make up the largest Christian community in the North Africa region. In fact, before Gamal Abdel Nasser took over as ruler, the Coptics were 10% of the country but owned 50% of the wealth. As members are no doubt aware, sporadic attacks and petty discrimination have been imposed on the Christian community in Egypt for centuries. However, over recent years, there has been a steady rise of these increased attacks, and I note the Honourable David Clarke covered them quite well. Suppression, religious intolerance and sectarian violence against the Coptic Christians. I particularly note recent reports of forced deportation, mob violence and targeted murders. In fact, just this week, 26 Coptic Christians, and since it's around 30, in Egypt were killed for their faith. And new reports have emerged that Egyptian soldiers drove over the protesters with armoured vehicles and fired live ammunition into crowds of Coptic Christians who had assembled to peacefully protest the government's failure to respond to the burning of a church by a Muslim military. Madam Deputy President, these protesters are not just people from a distant land. They're probably mums and dads, sons and daughters, grandparents, friends of friends and relatives. They're people like you and I, and they have a right to protest peacefully. Madam Deputy President, among other ongoing concerns is the Egyptian government's refusal to allow converts to Christianity to change their religious status on state-issued identification cards, and Egypt's prohibition of building or renovating churches unless presidential permission is granted. Imagine, Madam Deputy President, if we ran the same sort of system here. It would be outrageous. I say quite emphatically, it is a basic human right for an individual or community, in public or private, to manifest religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship and observance without persecution. There continues to be a failure by the Egyptian government to effectively investigate properly and prosecute those responsible. This is unacceptable. I note the Australian Parliament's recent unanimous condemnation of the persecution of Coptic Christians in Egypt, and the calling of the government to make immediate representations of the Coptic issue both to the UN and to the Egyptian government. I wholeheartedly implore this government to do the same. Madam Deputy President, above human rights comes human responsibility, and that is our responsibility to act when these basic rights are denied. Madam Deputy President, we must continue to pray for the peace and unity in the Middle East. I commend the motion to the House.
The Honourable Ficarra.
Madam Deputy President, on behalf of so many Australian Egyptian Copts, and I welcome those representatives who are in the gallery today, at last, at short notice, representing so many thousands, tens of thousands of their fellow countrymen. And indeed, on behalf of so many decent and peace-loving Australians of all backgrounds, I thank the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile for bringing forth this motion before the House today. Reverend Nile, along with representatives of all parties in this great Parliament, have regularly and soundly voiced their protest at not only the current Egyptian military rulers, but also the former Mubarak regime for allowing the continuing persecution of Egyptian Christians over many, many years. But now, Madam Deputy President, it's escalated to a point that world leaders are saying loudly, stop immediately. What is happening betrays the fine and noble history of Egypt, and the majority of its people, especially Islamic families as well as Christian families, want to live in peace in Egypt. It is a minority of troublemakers who are taking advantage of the current power vacuum in Egypt to forge their own greedy power base to replace the long-term authoritarian rule by Hosni Mubarak. So much for regime change as we are seeing across the Middle East. It is becoming disappointing. The magic of Egypt, a wonderful country with wonderful people, has captured me on both of my visits there, but will I ever return? After my last visit in January this year, the undercurrents of sectarian violence, never fully suppressed by the powerful hand of Mubarak, have been surfacing repeatedly and stronger than ever. The current military control has proven ineffective, giving rise to great concern of ongoing violence. People are dying in unprecedented numbers because of their professions of Christian faith. And as we've heard from previous speakers, in Nasborough, 24 Copts were violently killed, and over 200 have been wounded on Sunday the 9th of October. Bodies were mashed and bones were crushed. Many had fractures and lacerations of intestines from trauma inflicted by armoured tanks, while in others deaths were caused by gunshot. The inhumanity of some Egyptian soldiers who disposed of 9 bodies by throwing them into the Nile River is a disgrace. And these soldiers, all military soldiers and commanders that participate in such violent acts must be prosecuted and must be done so publicly and immediately by the Egyptian military rulers. And incredibly, we hear from the Egyptian military rulers that to understand that the soldiers in white gear and armoured tanks were terrified of an angry crowd of demonstrators that had to defend themselves in this brutal manner. It is laughable. No one believes that. International leaders condemn the Egyptian Military Council and its interim government for the continuation of persecution against Egypt's peace-loving Christian community. The European Union and the United States have expressed alarm at the military's aloof response to the bloodshed that its troops inflicted on unarmed civilians. And I want to congratulate Craig Kelly, Federal Member for Hughes in the Federal Parliament, who on the 9th of September moved a motion similar to that before us today, and yesterday that motion was adopted, sending a strong and clear message to the Egyptian diplomats in Sydney and Canberra who are representing the Egyptian government. And together we stand today in a bipartisan manner, and I'm very proud of that, to deliver the same strong message to the Egyptian government from the New South Wales Parliament. These recent reports of violence were the latest in a worsening pattern of destabilisation, and many other speakers have spoken of that today. The arson attack on the Coptic churches have been going on for years, and in my last visit earlier this year, papers were filled with speculation about why Mubarak, with all the power he's held, was not preventing them or bringing all of those behind them to justice. The majority of Egyptians that I met and talked to about the situation have felt betrayed by their military-backed rulers for years. Families want to live in peace, including and especially the Islamic Egyptians, whose livelihoods have been destroyed. And these families will continue to suffer with little income coming into their households. Egypt depends so much on tourism. This major sector has died off since January, and the escalating economic distress is obvious, causing further anger with the ineptitude and corruption of the Egyptians' military-backed rulers. The US and other nations have been pouring money into the Egyptian economy, hoping desperately that their leaders will be honourable and professional, be fair and just to their people, will rule with decency. Indeed, these nations now demand such action. And what began with a peaceful demonstration on Sunday became bloodbaths of the armed forces that should be protecting democracy did more than just turn a blind eye to the murderous thugs. The army encouraged and participated in the killings. The word Copt has the same origin as the word Egypt, the Western world's name for this ancient nation, Christianity being brought to Egypt by St Mark in 45 AD. And the Copts split from the rest of the Christian world in 451 over a theological difference. But, it was in 629 a messenger from Muhammad was killed on his way to Byzantium. 10 years later, the Arab armies swept unopposed into Alexandria, and the Copts were selectively taxed. Their ancient written and spoken languages were suppressed. The monks, carriers of their faith and knowledge, retreated behind stone walls, and by the mid-19th century, many monks were impoverished to the point of begging from tourists. And then the population, 10% of the population were Christian. Since then, largely, if not entirely through their own efforts, Copts have advanced in terms of their education, their professions, their wealth, and importance to the cultural and economic life of Egypt, and indeed every country that they have migrated to. Although they are still a minority, Egypt has 82 million people, and 12 million of them are Coptic Christians. These peace-loving people are more than pulling their weight in this multicultural and multi-ethnic society. And from what I've seen from my own eyes and heard from many voices, they are not seen as a threat by non-Christian Egyptians who share their longing for a good life. Peace, prosperity, representational government, fairness, and above all, freedom to enjoy family life are what the majority of all Egyptians want, including Islamic families. So why has this violence against Copts flared so often, particularly since 1980? The only obvious answer is that some people, stirred by the intensity of radical preaching, any religious practices other than their own are a threat, and they've been met with violence. The Copts have not been causing this reaction by any behaviour that sensible, rational people would describe as threatening, any more than did the Gypsies or the Jewish people's behaviour threaten their countrymen in Nazi Germany. Religious hatred has a tendency to escalate. It provokes even more violent reaction, and we should all fear this. The bloody divisions of the old Raj in India and Pakistan in 1947 saw sectarian violence in which millions died. Many lost their homes, economic progress was set back, and the seeds were sown for enduring bad relations between nuclear-armed neighbouring states. Even in modern Europe, where major wars over the centuries were so destructive that the United Nations, the European Union and the NATO alliance were created at great cost to prevent war in that region, old religious hatreds have flared. The Catholics of Ireland have over the centuries repeatedly taken up arms against what they saw as a Protestant oppression. And in the late 20th century, urban guerrilla religious war flourished in that country with tragic consequences for many innocent people. people. In the former Yugoslavian states, religious differences and ancient hatreds fled into a series of open bloody wars of ferocity, and the scale that the rest of modern Europe thought had been consigned to the history of that part of the world. Now, observing Egypt, we have to ask ourselves as elected representatives, what are we prepared to do to prevent escalation of religious violence in a region that is so volatile, in a country that borders the nuclear-armed state of Israel? We must recognise that religious violence harms all Egyptians of all faiths, and we must not be tricked into a broad condemnation of the non-Christian Egyptians who don't condone this violence just because they share some of the religious beliefs and practices of the violent jihadists. In my experience of such Egyptians, Islam is a powerful moral force and a valued religion. Many of their faith-based practices, including the expression of devotion to one God, giving help to the poor, behaving justly and providing support for their families, are common to the greatest religions of the world, including Christianity. Many courageous and deeply troubled Muslims have joined the Coptic protests, sharing with Copts the view that the real threat to society is religious intolerance, not religious diversity. Egypt can, I believe, recover from this latest violence and emerge as a strong nation of people who respect each other's rights to practice their religion. That is what the overwhelming majority of Egyptians want. We must not echo any sentiments in favour of a return to the harsh times of the Mubarak rule, in which prisons were crowded with outspoken reform-minded but non-violent people. Under repressive regimes, peace comes at a very high price, and the Egyptian people are no longer prepared to pay this price, and hence the peaceful demonstrations at the beginning. For Copts, the peace under Mubarak's rule was always fragile and never total. Fear abounded. Many people of both major faiths in Egypt died to rid themselves of this oppression, and we owe it to them not to support any turning back of the march to democracy and the freedom of expression. That is the only true path to sustain religious tolerance, as we Australians know so well. And finally, we must speak out as we do now. We must not be distantly or fearfully silent. In 2010, when my passport was in Egyptian consular hands, awaiting a visa, I was proud to speak out publicly in Macquarie Street, expressing my outrage at what was happening under Mubarak. Today, I join with all others in this great House to again strongly condemn the actions of those who have Egyptian blood on their hands and hatred in their hearts. Australians believe that religious buildings, houses of worship and prayer should never be a target for anyone's rage or arson. I say the provocation of non-violent street demonstrations is never a justification for any murderous, violent response, and I say that fear should never be forced into our hearts by hateful reaction to the religious views that we hold. We must all say this, and we must expect our government spokesman to say it too on behalf of all Australians, and it's a great honour to support this motion before the House.
The Honourable Shaoquett Moselmane. Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. I rise also to support this motion and thank the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile and all speakers, and in particular I want to thank the Honourable Marie Ficarra for her excellent speech in a very balanced and warm, shall I say, speech that she's just delivered. I rise, Mr. Acting Deputy President, to condemn the senseless killing of the 26 innocent protesters and injuring over 300 at last Black Sunday's protest. And I condemn not only that act, but the many acts over the last decades that the Coptic people of Egypt have suffered for the last 50, 60 years and more. Some protesters, Mr. Acting Deputy President, died of bullet wounds, and others crushed by military vehicles ramming through peaceful protesters. No matter what excuse the military gives, the fact remains that witnesses, videos and autopsies have shown and confirmed that many of the 2 dozen killed were crushed to death by military vehicles.
one of the excuses the military has given, which is the remnant of the Mubarak regime, and that's the military, was that the soldiers feared for their lives, as 300 unarmed soldiers feared for their lives facing 6,000 protesters, a few of whom were carrying apparently knives, sticks and stones. And the other serious reason was that the Coptic priests had allegedly threatened the top military officer, Field Marshal Mohammed Hussein Tantawi. I watched, Mr. Acting Deputy President, news coverage with absolute dismay at the brutality and the level of violence executed against peaceful protesters. It is disturbing, it is shameful, and such behaviour and such extremism should have no place in modern Egypt or anywhere around the world for this matter. All people of faith must be able to practice and worship in peace and security. And the arms of the state, any state, and the arms of the state should not be stained by the blood of its own citizens. It was said that some of the sections of the Egyptian media even egg people on, telling their readers that the protesters are attacking the army and that they should go and help the army. If such reports and such incitement to violence is true, then those media outlets must also be condemned and must be investigated. The entire incident must be investigated and the perpetrators must be brought before a court of law. They must be brought to account and must pay the penalty. The revolution had passed on quite peacefully. It brought on hope for change and for more civil rights. It gave life back to the people of Egypt, and I hope that those who do come to power move Egypt into a democratic state representing the rule of law, respecting the people, respecting institutions, and respecting the rights of workers, the rights of women, and respecting the absolute rights of all minorities. I do hope that the constitution soon to be drawn respects the rights of minorities and direct the country to a more secular society. I do hope that the new political parties will not be infiltrated by people of influence and hidden agenda, be it self-interest or in the interest of powerful players abroad, pulling the strings, dividing and conquering. I hope for a bright future for Egypt, as I do for Yemen, for Morocco, for Syria, for Bahrain, for Iraq, as I do for the entire Middle East, and in particular, I do hope for the issue of Palestine and the people of Palestine are given what is rightfully theirs. Israel must stop oppressing the Palestinian people, and it must give them the rightful land that they deserve. And Israel must stop oppressing the entire people of Palestine. I wish the same for the Kurds, as I wish the same for the Armenians and the Australian Aborigines and all people who have been unjustly treated over the centuries past and present. Mr. Acting Deputy President, I would like to inject a measure of calm.
Sorry, order. Thank you. Can I just help you? It's not Acting Deputy President, it's Mr. Deputy President when I'm in the chair, and Madam Deputy President when the ladies are in the chair. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Deputy President. Mr. Deputy President, I would like to inject a measure of calm and a sense into this debate. I fear for Egypt sliding into the hands of fundamentalist extremists. I fear for all Egyptians, Christians and Muslims, who want to live in peace and security, who only want to feed their families and educate their children and live in a life of respect. Today there are 10 to 12% of Egyptian population made up of Egyptian Coptic Christians. Like most minorities in the Middle East, and I can say everywhere, have survival as their main concern. The Copts are discriminated against in all sorts of small and subtle ways. They are virtually powerless, and most of their energies are consumed trying to survive. Having said all this, I wish that the Coptic people of Egypt heed the words and follow the practices of His Holiness Pope Shenouda III, for whom I have great love and respect. I personally had the honour of welcoming him at Rockdale City when he last visited Sydney, Australia. I also want to take, Mr. Deputy President, the opportunity to welcome my friends from the Coptic community that are here in the public gallery. Mr. Deputy President, His Holiness has gone through thick and thin. He has been a beacon of hope for the Coptic people of Egypt. He has tread very carefully. And he is, to me, he is the Gandhi of the Arab world, a man of peace, a man of brotherhood, always calling for harmony and interfaith, and always calling for Egyptians to be one people first before being Muslims and Christians. He is reasoned and is always weary of those politicians and hotheads who want to inflame matters and sink the people of Egypt into a cycle of violence. We have to be wary of people who want to play the emotions. Otherwise, the cycle of violence will deepen. I call on all Egyptians to tread warily and carefully, calm and responsibly. The people of Egypt are now at a critical juncture, and the Coptic community must be wise to lead their people into a better, more free Egypt. Coptics will for centuries continue to live with their brothers and sisters in all other different religions, and the interests of the Coptic community, tempers must be contained and violence must be done away with. We must be careful not to allow extremists to hijack the debate and to make it out as if it was a war or a conflict between Muslims and Christians. It's not. Muslims around the world condemn the brutality, as all people of good faith condemn such brutality and extremism. And finally, Mr. Deputy President, once again, I want to congratulate the Honourable Fred Nile on bringing this motion forward.
Mr. David Shoebridge.
Mr. Deputy President, I rise on behalf of the Greens also to support the motion, and I thank the Reverend Fred Nile for bringing the motion to this House. I'd particularly like to note the balanced presentation of the Honourable Marie Ficarra and the history and the care and concern with which she addressed this matter, and I fully endorse all of her comments in her speech, as well as those of the Honourable Shaoquett Moselmane. That's not to ignore the contributions from other speakers who I think have all contributed to this debate and have all urged upon the people of Egypt tolerance, have all urged upon the people of Egypt to take a step back and ensure that we don't have these events lead to further hostility and division in a point in Egypt's history where I think all players need to move towards a new regime of tolerance and consideration, because religious tolerance and religious freedom and a society that respects and protects those matters are essential in any modern democracy, and no less so is that in Egypt than here in New South Wales. Now, while much of the history of Egypt is in fact one of tolerance and acceptance, I think we all must recognise that for centuries those Copts in Egypt have faced levels of oppression of a greater or lesser extent, such that it does at times deeply threaten their existence as a community and the safety and welfare of many of the individuals within that community in Egypt. We have recently seen repeated attacks on Copts in Egypt, on them as individuals, as them priests and members of faith. But we've also seen arson attacks on their churches, and all of these acts must be loudly condemned, not only here in New South Wales and Australia, but most particularly by the leadership, the new leadership there in Egypt. And of course, Coptic Christians were the great majority of some 25 people killed last Sunday in weekend clashes between utterly peaceful demonstrators and Egyptian security forces. And not only were there some 25 people killed, but there were scores and possibly hundreds also seriously injured in those protests in a crackdown of unparalleled brutality by the Egyptian security forces. And there have been credible reports backed up by evidence, video evidence, clear testimony from those present, that the Egyptian security forces fired upon the peaceful demonstrators, fired into crowds of peaceful demonstrators, that the Egyptian security forces then used armoured personnel carriers to drive over wounded and unarmed peaceful protesters, and cause some of those horrific injuries that I think were detailed to some extent in the Honourable Marie Ficarra's report. Of course we condemn that. Of course all members in this chamber condemn that. It is a great pity that we haven't seen that same condemnation from the current Egyptian leadership. And we have not seen that willingness to openly condemn it from the current Egyptian leadership. That must happen. Of course, Copts comprise approximately 10%, maybe a little more, of Egypt's 80 million people. And the laws that relate to the building, even the maintenance of churches for Copts in Egypt are totally unfair. And when compared against the far more liberal regime that applies to laws relating to the building and maintenance of mosques, it points out that this is a minority that is systematically discriminated against, not only in conduct but also in the laws of Egypt. Such uneven laws relating to religious groups are unfair and must be spoken against wherever they are found. It is good to note that members of the Egyptian leadership have noted in the last few days that they will be reviewing the laws in relation to Coptic churches. I see that as a statement of increasing tolerance from the leadership and a recognition that something needs to be done on the ground in Egypt. But we must also have those leaders openly say that they will bring to justice those military perpetrators of the violence of last Sunday. Justice is often a necessary element in seeking any long-term solution to these issues, and I think we all should call for justice, as indeed this motion does, and I support it in that regard. So Egypt is at a point in history now where there is an Arab Spring, and there's a time here where all communities across the globe should be pushing the leadership in Egypt to move towards tolerance, to move towards not just a constitution that puts in place rights for all minorities, but also have a government that's willing to act on laws and ensure that minority rights are respected. And I note with great concern the suffering of the Copts in Egypt. I note there the members of the community here in the gallery, and I look forward to this motion being passed unanimously by the House.
The Honourable Trevor.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy President. Mr. Deputy President, I rise also to support the motion and to congratulate the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile for bringing the motion before this House. As with the previous three speakers, the Honourable Marie Ficarra, the Honourable Shaoquett Moselmane and Mr. David Shoebridge, I congratulate each of them for their contributions, their very detailed analysis of the matter, and there seems little point in them going through the detailed work that they have already done. Could I note that on the 12th of October 2011, the New South Wales Minister for Citizenship and Communities, Victor Donnelly, expressed the New South Wales Government's condolences to the families of those killed and injured during the recent violent clashes in Egypt. He said, "Our deepest sympathies are with the families and friends of the people who were killed and injured in Egypt over the weekend." He further said, "Our thoughts and prayers are with all those affected by these tragedies, including with the local Egyptian Coptic community, which I know is strongly concerned and worried about the situation of relatives and friends. He says, I take this opportunity to also affirm the New South Wales Government's unequivocal support for freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and the universal goals of tolerance, community harmony and peaceful and democratic governance." Mr. Deputy President, could I observe that with respect to those final observations, that they very closely mimic the resolution adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations on the 10th of December 1948, a resolution that we all know as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. a document which I believe all of us should take the time to read from time to time and acknowledge its importance. It is a document that came about through the very important work undertaken by a number of very famous Australians, and all of them should be congratulated. Let me note Article 1 of the Declaration says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. Article 2. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, without distinction of any kind, such as of race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. Furthermore, no distinction shall be made on the basis of the political, jurisdiction or international status of the country or territory to which a person belongs, whether it be independent, trust, non-self-governing or under any other limitation of sovereignty. Article 3. Everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person. Article 4. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and the slave trade shall be prohibited in all their forms. Article 5. No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. I'll go to Article 7. All are equal before the law and entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination in violation of this declaration and against any incitement to such discrimination. Could I finally move to Article 18? Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others and in public or private to manifest this religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship and observance. It is a great document. It is one that we should all aspire, whether it is in Egypt or here, to see carried out in practice. Sadly, it is not in so many countries of the world, and sadly, from time to time, we ourselves forget the words of the Declaration. Perhaps the only further thing I wish to invite us all to consider is, as the Arab Spring takes root, or one hopes that it does, but one of the things that we move towards is to ensure that every Arab nation adopts the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and not only adopts it, but then sees its terms move into action in their own country through its legislation and organisations. Once again, I congratulate the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile for bringing this motion before the House.
The right, the Honourable Lynda Fazio.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. Mr Deputy President, I rise to support the motion moved by the Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile. I think it's something that we often take for granted here in Australia, that is our right to freedom of religion. The television news footage the other evening showing the Egyptian army attacking its own people who were simply peacefully protesting for their right for freedom of religion was shocking to all of us. I know that prior to the fall of the Mubarak regime there had been ongoing persecution of Coptic Christians and attacks on their churches. I think it's very disappointing for those who support democracy to see those actions continuing after the fall of the Mubarak regime. I wholeheartedly endorse the motion moved by the Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile, and I call on the Egyptian government to ensure that there is freedom of religion for all, that this attack is not used as an excuse by the Egyptian army to delay the introduction of full democracy to Egypt. And I sympathise with the Coptic Christians who are simply wanting their right to pursue their religion in freedom, without persecution, without fear, without having their churches burnt, without being attacked on the streets when they go about a peaceful protest, to highlight their continued concerns about this persecution. We all know that Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile is a strong supporter of freedom of religion, and we know, because we've had lots of demonstrations out the front of this Parliament, that the Coptic Christian community here in New South Wales is very concerned about the oppression that they're suffering overseas. And I wholeheartedly support their campaign for religious freedom in Egypt, and hope that when democracy is fully restored to Egypt, it's in a way that supports the nature of the Egyptian democracy, which is supposed to be a secular democracy. It's not supposed to be as an Islamic state. And I call on all people in this House who support freedom of religion, freedom of speech, to support the Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile's motion, because this is an important issue that has a serious impact on the Coptic Christian community here in Australia, and we need to show them our support and stand in solidarity with them in response to these dreadful attacks.
The Honourable Gregg Donnelly. Thank you, Acting President, and I rise to support the motion that's before the House.
Deputy President.
Sorry. Did I say Acting President?
Mr. Deputy President.
Mr. Deputy President. I thought it was Acting President. Same thing.
Nothing to do with it.
No, okay.
It's the process.
I rise to associate myself strongly with the motion before the House of the Honourable Fred Nile, and I'd like to put on record, as members would probably already know, the Honourable Fred Nile, who's been in this House for 30 years this year, has been a constant flag bearer for the Coptic community in Australia in terms of motions before this House, and he is to be congratulated for that. Mr. President, in regard to the motion, he specifically concentrates on what's been the most recent attack, of course, last Sunday in Cairo, in Egypt, and I don't intend to go through what can only be described over the gruesome and terrible details associated with that incident last weekend. But as many speakers have said already, that this is in fact not just an isolated incident, but in fact sort of one of a series of incidences which have taken place not just in recent time, but one can go back a significant period of time. Can I note that earlier this year in Martin Place on the 9th of January there was a public rally which I attended along with other members of this House. I think it was Honourable David Clarke and Honourable Ficarra there, along with others as well. And that particular rally itself was a rally which was condemning what was killings in November last year, but specifically some killings which took place on New Year's Eve in terms of the bombing of a church. And at that rally, it was very well attended. We saw large, what were blown up photographs of people who had lost their lives. And what struck me about those photographs is that many of them were women, young men, children, elderly people, people who were just endeavouring to practice their faith peacefully, and had been brutally killed in what was obviously a terrorist act in a church. Following that, I undertook, as was asked of me by members of the Australian Coptic movement, to write to both the Prime Minister of Australia and the Foreign Minister of Australia, which I did do. And I just want to read onto the record some paragraphs from that correspondence, of which I duly received a response from. In the letter I said, and I quote, and it's my letter dated the 15th of February 2011, I write, to you to express my concern and the concerns of the over 80,000 Coptic Christians in Australia about the Australian government's failure to condemn the persecution and attacks being perpetrated against the Coptic Christians in Egypt. I recently had the opportunity to address a large peaceful rally in Sydney's Martin Place organised by the Australian Coptic Movement Association. There were a number of speakers at the rally from across the political divide, including activists and clergy. The rally was organised in the aftermath of the terrible car bomb attack in Alexandria, Egypt on New Year's Eve, where 23 worshippers and midnight mass were killed and over 70 maimed and injured. Of course, as you would be aware, this matter is not an isolated incident. Persecution and attacks on the innocent Coptic Christians in Egypt over many decades have been well documented. It should be noted that the attacks have not been provoked in any way and have been launched against innocent people going about their daily lives. I also note that threats were made against certain Coptic churches in Australia earlier this year. So I'm going to say, I want to in fact comment on this later, what the members of the Coptic community in Australia do not understand is why the Australian government has not been forthright in condemning these attacks. As you would appreciate, many in the community have family and friends in Egypt and are disappointed that the Australian government, well known internationally for taking strong stances on fundamental human rights issues, appears to be doing little more than acknowledging the attacks and expressing condolences. This, the Coptic community in Australia believe, is not satisfactory and leaves a lot to be desired. Of course, the issue is further exacerbated by the recent ongoing protests and instability in Egypt. How those matters finally resolve themselves, only time will tell. Having said that, there is grave concerns amongst the Coptic community in Australia that Coptic Christians in Egypt could be further targeted by religious extremists and other intolerant groups in that country. In these circumstances, it seems that consideration should be given by the Australian government to introduce a specific refugee immigration program for Coptic Christians seeking to flee persecution in Egypt. I have also been asked to request that the Australian government obtains on an ongoing basis from both our ambassador in Egypt and Egypt's ambassador in Australia specific reports about the welfare and treatment of Coptic Christians in that country. Those reports should be made available to the public. It is also the view of the Coptic community in Australia, as member of the international community, members of the international community should advance the argument in the context of proposed constitutional change in Egypt that Article 2 of the Constitution be amended to provide for the recognition of freedom of religion in that country. And finally, the Coptic community in Australia is peaceful, devout and family orientated. They are law-abiding citizens and just wish to get on with their lives. They wish that their family and friends back in Egypt can be allowed to get on with their lives without fear and persecution. Whatever the Australian government can do to help achieve this will be deeply appreciated. Mr Deputy President, in terms of responses, as I said, I did get responses to both these letters, and I have forwarded those responses on earlier this year to representatives of the Australian Coptic movement in Australia. But I did want to just focus on a couple of points that I think do need further attention by the Australian government, and this is a consideration of specific refugee immigration accommodation for persecuted Coptic Christians who would like to make their way to Australia and settle with their family. There's no doubt in my mind that there is a very strong case, because of the circumstances being experienced in Egypt, for consideration to be given, and I do call on the Australian government to do that. The issue I raise further on about this Article 2 of the Constitution of Egypt really deserves some attention, because the way in which that particular provision in the Constitution is framed, it essentially prohibits the recognition of other religions in that country. And if we are talking about freedom of religion, genuine freedom of religion in that country, what will have to come about is a new constitution in whatever form it finally takes, but one that does not contain a provision like its current Article 2, which in effect prohibits the practice of religions under the Constitution other than Islam at the moment. Can I also pay tribute to the Australian Coptic Movement Association in Australia? They do wonderful work. They have worked tirelessly on behalf of the Coptic community in Australia and Coptic Christians in Egypt, and continue to do great work advocating on behalf of those people, and I would like to extend my best wishes to them and encouragement, and I ask you to please continue your tireless work. And can I say it's wonderful to see particularly young members of that organisation who are very active on behalf of their community, speaking out forthrightly and using social media and other forms of communication readily available to make sure that people in Australia understand what is happening in Egypt and pressing for the Australian government to do more than it actually is. Can I also particularly acknowledge the work of the clergy? The clergy in Australia, as I understand there are 50 churches, are working closely with the Coptic community in Australia to give them support and comfort, and of course prayer and spiritual guidance at this time. It is the most terrible time. We just can't see an end to what has been happening. Certainly the persecution goes back over a long period of time, but if we look at the last 12 months in particular, and certainly over the course of this year, there have been some terrible incidences which must break the heart of the clergy in this country, and the care that they're providing to their flock is wonderful, and I'd ask that the representatives today pass it on to the clergy when you next have an opportunity to speak to them. I'll conclude on that point, I think, but simply saying I do associate myself with the range of comments that have been made in the House this morning. I think we are at one with our condemnation of this action. We understand as elected representatives that we are so fortunate to have a democracy where we have freedom and liberty, and that enables the practice of religion by those who wish to do so in a society where we are free from this type of awful actions, and made terribly worse by the fact that on the evidence that is there, the government through the military appears to be directly involved, and that type of circumstance is almost unthinkable as a circumstance that could happen in Australia today. So I conclude my comments by simply saying I fully support the resolution of the Honourable Fred Nile, and I hope that all members, and I'm sure of this House, will in fact support it. Thank you.
Honourable Sophie Cotsis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I rise in support of the Reverend Honourable Fred Nile's motion. Madam Deputy President, it saddens me to see these types of scenes that are coming out from Egypt, and it's very distressing and it's very concerning that citizens, Coptic Christian citizens, are being attacked, and I would like today to express my outrage at these attacks that are occurring against Coptic Christians in Egypt. It is outrageous and it is unnecessary. It is a very difficult period in Egypt at present, and it has been for a while. But this is a very difficult time for Egyptian people, regardless of religion or race, and we, the international community, stand with them in these difficult periods, but I find it abhorrent that peaceful protests that are being held in the streets of Egypt are being taken over by gangs, and people are being butchered in the streets. And it distresses me to see that these peaceful protests are turning into it's just very distressful seeing that peaceful protesters are being butchered, and I express my deep sorrow and condolences to the families whose sons and daughters have been butchered in this seamless act. I have, as I indicated from the outset, I've watched with horror at what has been happening, and I've been keeping up to date with the news and information that's coming from Egypt, and also been talking to some of my good friends from the Coptic Christian community, Australian Coptic Christian community, who are very upset and distressed that their families are going through this period in Egypt. As previous speakers have indicated their support for this motion and have spoken with passion about this very important motion, what is going on in Egypt. I too would like to add my voice, and again I find it distressing that last Sunday there were at least what we know of 26 Coptic Christians who were killed and over 400 who were injured while engaging in a peaceful protest, Madam Deputy President, and they were protesting against an earlier destruction and burning of a church in Egypt. Now, what distresses me is that I find that any place of worship is a very important and special place for people of all races or religions, where they find comfort to practice their faith or religion in this special place of worship. It distresses me greatly to see that the churches are being burnt and destroyed, and this is not a good thing. So, Madam Deputy President, what I've been, as I said, I've been seeing what's been going on and been reading the information and talking to my friends here in Sydney, and they too are very worried and very concerned about their friends and relatives. And I congratulate the federal government for acting quickly and putting out a statement, and I also congratulate the Australian Parliament yesterday for carrying a resolution and standing shoulder to shoulder and condemning these attacks. You've all heard what's happened, and I'm not going to repeat that information, but I would like to acknowledge our friends from the Australian Coptic Christian community who are here today in the public gallery. I have, as I indicated, a number of friends from that community, and I have grown up. When I was growing up, I grew up with my neighbours. They were Coptic Christians, and we shared many good times growing up together and had many things in common, our values in terms of education and work ethic. And I congratulate the hard work and commitment that the Australian Coptic Christians put into the Australian community. You do an excellent job, and we stand with you shoulder to shoulder at this very difficult time in the history of Egypt, but also as a community, we are with you. We do share your pain. We know that you are suffering immensely at this time, where your friends and relatives who want to protest, every citizen should have the right to protest peacefully. And again, I just can't help saying that it distresses me that your churches, your places of worship are being burnt, and people are dying and injured. So I hope that the international community can come together, and with our support we can hopefully do something. So commend the motion to the House. Thank you.
Mr. President. Madam Deputy President.
Okay.
Madam Deputy President, I rise very briefly to give my wholehearted support to the motion of the Reverend the Honourable Fred Nile and to thank him for bringing this extremely important issue to the chamber. My presentation is much shorter than the gravity and the seriousness and the human tragedy of such an event and series of events, not just the events of the last few weeks or the events of the past few years, but the events of the past few decades deserve. It is absolutely clear, and I also want to thank the Honourable Trevor and the Honourable Marie Ficarra for their presentations and all other members for their commitment to the cause of human rights. Religious violence is as irrational as it is destructive. It's not just destructive of the victims, although you spend 2 minutes imagining what it would be like to not be able to live safely in your own country purely because of the beliefs you hold, the religious beliefs you hold, or your ethnicity, or your sexuality, or any other characteristic of yours which is yours and your right to hold. The idea that you cannot live safely, that your places of worship, your most sacred places are at risk, that you personally at risk, that your family is at risk, that you are systematically discriminated against, is an offence against humanity, and no person on the surface of the planet should have to undergo that. And it is very clear that not just the present situation of the Copts in Egypt, but the history says that this has gone on too long. It is time, as the Reverend Nile said, as the Honourable David Clarke said, it is time for this to change. It must change. It will change. But religious violence is not only an assault against the victims, it's also an assault against the reputation of the innocent bystanders. And I pay particular tribute to Marie Ficarra for pointing out the millions of innocent Egyptians who are not Copts, whose name and whose reputation is being smeared by the actions of a minority. And it is important that we understand that. It's important that we redouble our condemnation of the perpetrators of this crime against humanity. But it is also an act that damages those who perpetrate it, because they themselves are damaged to their core. They are denying themselves that fundamental aspect of humanity, which is our respect for each other. And by doing so, they are taking themselves out of the accepted behaviour of humanity, and they are taking themselves out of the values that make a society work. I want to finish, but I want to do three things. I want to thank the Coptic Christian community of Australia for keeping this issue alive. And I understand many of you have family back in Egypt, and many of you, for you, it's a very close and personal thing, and I, as much as it is possible to do so, we this Parliament, we weep with you and we bleed with you and we understand what's going on. But I also want to thank you for the courage you've shown in standing up not just for your rights, but for the minority rights of every individual on the surface of the planet. And as the Honourable Trevor in his presentation said, this is about making the Universal Declaration of Human Rights not just a document, but a fact, a reality. The second thing I want to say is that this is a matter that transcends purely partisan politics. It transcends the obligations of Australians. It transcends the obligations of people of any particular faith. This is a matter of humanity. This is an assault on humanity and must come to an end. The third thing I want to say is thank you to all members of Parliament who have, not just now, but over the past 3 decades at least, been active on this issue and have kept us all focused on this issue. I strongly support the motion. My party strongly supports the motion. I'm sure that all members of this Parliament support the motion.
The Honourable Reverend Fred Nile in reply.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I thank all members who participated in this debate on this very important motion, and particularly for the bipartisan support for this motion by all the political parties represented in this House, and also by members who would represent all various viewpoints, religious viewpoints, including our Muslim member who supported this motion. So I thank each one, the Honourable David Clarke, Honourable Walter Secord, the Honourable Lynda Voltz, the Honourable Paul Green, the Honourable Marie Ficarra, the Honourable Moselmane, the Honourable David Shoebridge, the Honourable Trevor, the Honourable Amanda Fazio, the Honourable Gregg Donnelly, and the Honourable Sophie Cotsis, and finally the Honourable Dr. John Kay. And each member has made a valuable contribution with their participation, and not just in an academic way, but in a heartfelt way of genuine concern for the future of the Egyptian people, and particularly of the Coptic Christian community. I thank again the Coptic representatives who have come here today, and I hope that the views that have been expressed by all the members has been a great encouragement to you, because I know often various ethnic groups feel isolated or alone and forgotten, and we've shown you are not forgotten or alone. We stand with you here today. But please take back the support of the members of this House back to your community, to your churches, and also to your clergy. As we conclude this debate, I'm sure we'll all continue to pray, particularly for the future of Egypt, as it goes through this stage of developing a constitution and having a future election. And I would encourage, in whatever way I can, for all Egyptians to participate in that process, including the Coptic community, which often has been isolated, that they see this as the opportunity for them to fully participate in the political processes in Egypt and have their voice expressed through that opportunity, which we all experience here in Australia. So I have had many happy visits to Egypt, and I look forward to future visits, and I've always had great fellowship with the Egyptian people. I know my name, Nile, always gets a very warm response in Egypt, and I've often been questioned by some officials that I've met, saying, it cannot be your name, you've made it up, and I've had to show them my passport to prove it is actually my name. So even though I have nothing to do with Egypt historically or in my heritage, I do have a very warm love for the Egyptian people. So I thank the members for the support for this motion.
Order. The question is that notice of motion number 295 be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Madam Deputy President. Thank you. The Honourable Amanda Fazio. Madam Deputy.